Lifting is in reality physics, and if you understand physics and use it in your training, you will have a very easy time getting huge because you'll be able to manipulate resistance curves and make movements length and biased. And that's exactly why today we're going to discuss physics for lifting. If you do not understand something, then today you will finally learn it, and then you can use that knowledge to improve your training. So, physics for lifting. We're gonna start off with gravity with free weights. As you can see here, this here is gravity, and gravity always pulls down naturally. Obviously, you probably learned this, right? So that's what we're going to have to use when we go to movements with free weights. So for an example, with barbells, dumbbells, shit like that. This will mean that a lift like a dumbbell curl will be hardest at around the mid-range. This drawing looks really bad. This is not this big, but as you can see here, this is the hardest because this is where gravity is perpendicular to your lower arm, which means that the movement arm is going to be the biggest here, so that's why the movement is going to be the most difficult here. You can also see that he's really struggling and tears are coming from his eyes, because this, by the way, is 90 degrees right here. And for an example, this is why at the beginning of the movement you don't feel as much tension, it's not as hard, and also at the top of the movement it's not as hard. This is where it's gonna be the hardest. This is where the sticking point usually is when it comes to dumbbell curls. This whole thing makes this lift mid-range biased. Then we got a preacher curl exactly to correct this, where we put the arms at an angle. So you can see that now it's not just by your side, it's a little bit in front of you and it's at an angle. He has huge fucking veiny biceps. And because of this, the hardest portion of the lift is going to be the bottom of the lift, which will make it more length and biased, because when it's hardest, your bicep is more stretched than on the other one, where here you can see your arms are basically here. This is also 90 degrees, but here it is way more, which means that your biceps are way more stretched here when it's the hardest versus here. That's why a preacher curl is generally going to be better than a normal standing dumbbell curl, because it's more length and bias. This is also the same reason why an overhead tricep extension is going to be a pretty good movement, because when you look here, this is how you start the movement, right? This is the dumbbell right here. And here is where the movement is gonna be the toughest. This is where the sticking point is, where this is 90 degrees right here. And this is pretty much in the beginning of the movement. It's probably at like 1/4 of the range of motion, where your triceps are still really stretched. And that's why this is an excellent movement. And this guy looks like he's either pulling out the Excalibur or has a dick that's long, or I don't know. I tried to make good drawings, but everything looks so bad. Next, we got gravity with cables. The difference between cables and free weights is going to be that when it comes to free weights, you can see here that gravity will always pull down. This guy is doing a row, but he has to bend over because otherwise it's not going to work. This guy is doing a bench press right here, which is obviously again against gravity, and then this guy is doing a dumbbell curl where again the gravity pulls down. But here, when it comes to the cables, this guy is doing a cable row, and as you can see, the weight is going in this direction, so he will have to pull in the opposite direction. When it comes to lat pull down, gravity will pull up, basically, and you will have to pull down. When it comes to a curl, for an example, where it comes from behind you, you do it like this. It will pull in this direction. So as you can see here, when it comes to cables, gravity will always pull in the direction where the cable is coming from, and that's really good for us because that means that we can basically manipulate gravity and have gravity come from wherever we want to. So for an example, if you would want to do a tricep push down with free weights, you would have to either stand on your head or hang from somewhere somehow. As you can see, he's also set, his stairs are falling up, yes, because I drew the guy normally and then I just flipped him, so it's kind of fucked up. But gravity will pull down, and that's why you will have to be basically standing on your head to be able to do a dumbbell tricep push down. That's exactly why this is not really an existing movement. But then we have the cable, and the cable allows us to not stand on our heads, because now you can basically just set the cable high up, and then gravity is going to pull in the direction where the cable is coming from, so now you can just easily do tricep pushdowns. So with this, now you understand that where the cable is coming from is always where gravity will go towards when we're talking about cable exercises. Now, when we take a preacher curl and move it to the cable, let's say that we set up the cable here really down below, and the preacher curl is pretty close to the cable machine. This is where it's going to be the hardest, and this is still a pretty good movement. This is pretty much like a preacher curl with a dumbbell. Now, what happens if we set it a little bit higher? Well, now it becomes more like a dumbbell curl in terms of the resistance curve, because it's gonna be mid-range bias. It's gonna be hardest at the mid-range, which is not as good for us, I guess. And then we have this. Well, this just shit. The range of motion is not even that much, because when your arm is gonna be here, you're barely gonna be feeling anything, and it's gonna be the hardest here when your biceps are very shortened. So this is gonna be a really shortened bias movement. So as you can see, the more you move the cable up here, the worse it becomes, and essentially the more shortened biased it becomes. Let's go back. We got it again from below. We're at the same place, so now it's pretty good. What happens if you move away from the cable? Well, now it again becomes a little bit more shortened biased, because before you had it like this. So your arms were pretty stretched out, or your biceps, sorry, but here not as much, because now you're more away from the cable. So as you can see here, you have to bend your arm a little bit more to get to the hardest portion of the lift. So this is again going to be kind of like a dumbbell curl. It's more mid-range bias. With this, you now understand why doing a cable curl with a bar from in front of you while standing a little bit away from the cable is a completely garbage exercise, because as you can see here, this is gonna be the hardest portion of the lift. Here I stopped drawing in the yellow sign anymore, because you can probably see it anyways, that this is 90 degrees, this, all of this is 90 degrees, obviously. So this is where the hardest portion of the lift is, when you're doing a cable curl that's coming from in front of you and below you at the same time, kinda, and you're standing a little bit away from the cable. This is shit, because as you can see, you have almost finished with the movement already when it's the hardest. So it's gonna be very short and biased. Here on the second one, we have improved it a little bit. We stood closer, so now it's coming from below, so now it's mid-range bias. The only real problem essentially is when it's coming from below, you're basically doing a dumbbell curl. So why the fuck are you even doing this? A lot of people think that, oh, cables smooth out the resistance curve. No, they don't. No, the only thing that cables do realistically is they change gravity. And if somebody who's like a physics teacher would hear this, they would say like, no, obviously they do not change gravity. Well, yeah, they don't, but for you they do, because when you're lifting, you're going to be lifting against the cable. So essentially it doesn't really change gravity, it just changes where the resistance goes towards, because usually normally it would go towards the floor because there's gravity, but now it doesn't. It goes towards where the cable is coming from. But here, this is pretty much still like a dumbbell curl. On the third one, we got a little bit better because we turned around, and now the cable is coming from behind us, which is really nice. And now, as you can see, it's going to start getting difficult more towards the bottom of the range of motion. Here on the fourth one, we even stood a little bit further away from the cable. So now, as you can see, it's very, very lengthened biased. Our arms are almost completely locked out, basically. And that's where it's the most hard. And then we're gonna go into number 5, which is when you set it up even higher and you're also standing a little bit away from it. And now basically it's the most difficult when your arms are completely stretched. Now on paper this should be the best, but something I would say is like, I was experimenting with this in the past couple of weeks, and it feels kind of awkward. So it doesn't mean necessarily that this is always going to be the best, and that whenever your muscles are the most stretched, if that's when the lift is the most difficult, that's going to be the best. So with this you can definitely improve your training, but I'm just saying that do not try to focus on turning every single lift that you have into something like this, because also this, if you try this yourself, it's going to feel a little bit awkward. I prefer this version, number 4, because this still feels like a curl. It still feels good, but it's also very lengthened bias, but not as much as this one. This is a little bit of an overkill. This is also the same idea that's behind lateral raises. When you look at a dumbbell lateral raise, here there's no tension, and this is where the muscle is the most stretched. However, as you lift your arms up more and more, it's going to become harder and harder, and here at the top of the movement, when your side delt muscles are the most contracted, this is where gravity is going to be perpendicular to your arms. And this is why this is going to be an extremely short and biased movement, and that doesn't make it a bad movement. Most of the time when a movement is very short and biased, and you know, it's something like this here, it's probably going to be garbage, to be honest, but not always, because time-testedness beats this whole thing. So do not think that just because a movement is not very lengthened biased, maybe it's mid-range biased, or maybe it's even shortened biased, it's going to be bad. No. If a movement is time-tested, it doesn't really matter, you know. If it has been working for people for, I don't know, over 10 years or over a couple of years, it's going to be a good movement, alright? But with that said, the lateral raise is still not the best movement, although it's a pretty good movement. As you can see, the guy is struggling here, but he's not gonna get as much gains from this as he's going to get from this, which is the cable lateral raise. The difference is that here, as you can see, when the movement is the hardest, that's when your side delts are gonna be the most contracted. However, when you put in a cable that's coming from below, this is where the movement is gonna be the hardest, which is way better. Before, your arms were like this when it was the hardest. Now they are like this, so this is kind of mid-range bias, so this is pretty good. And then another thing you can do is set the cables up higher. So now it's gonna be hardest at the beginning when your side delts are the most stretched, and this is why cable lateral raises are way better than dumbbell lateral raises. And this is excellent, but the thing is, I know that not everybody has a cable station which allows you to set it anywhere. Maybe the one that you have allow you only to have it from below or from above. So that's where now you know exactly what to do, right? Because you already learned the physics of lifting. So there are two things you can do essentially. You're this guy here. Number one thing you can do is kneel down. When you kneel down, you're going to be more like this, because now your hands are going to be lower and the cable is going to stay in the same place. So that's essentially like raising the cable. Another thing you can do, as we've seen before with the preacher curl, is just go further away, because if you go further away, your arms are going to have to be less lifted up when the movement is going to be the hardest. And also you can actually combine the two and get probably pretty close to having this one, even though the cable is coming from below. Now next we got a great example of somebody using physics to improve the training. So I was at the gym and I saw girls doing, you know, this machine that looks like a dick here again, but this is the good girl bad girl machine. This is one of those. I think it's a bad girl, because here you're spreading your legs. So so this is you, these are your legs right here, and this whole thing that goes around, this is a machine, and here are the pads, and essentially you have to open your legs like this against the machine. This is the machine. Now what these girls did was they came with yoga bricks and they put it between the pads and the legs, and with that they not only got more range of motion, but they got more range of motion in the most valuable portion of the lift, because this is when the muscles that you're trying to target with this, which are somewhere around your hips, your ass kinda, those are gonna be the most stretched here at the beginning of the movement. And because the machine was like this, it doesn't really allow you to use it when that muscle is the most stretched, because it doesn't come together enough, if that makes sense. So that's where the yoga bricks come in that you put here, and now you got a little bit more range of motion, and you can still spread it to like the same amount essentially, but you get a bigger range of motion in the beginning, which is real nice. And this is a great example of using physics to improve an exercise that you already have. Now, did they actually understand the physics behind it? I don't fucking know, but what they did was good, so nice. I just realized that this drawing looks even worse than this one. But the point is, now that you know all of this, you can use it to improve your training, you can use it to improve exercises that you already have in your program, but you can make them even better. And you can also click here to watch my last video.